after the Civil War, another literary movement came into existence. This literary movement is called Naturalism and Realism. And so in Naturalism and Realism, you write the story exactly as it is. You don't hide any of the grisly details. You don't romanticize it. And you just write everything as it is, objectively. And so the generation of writers that followed William Dean Howard's broke with their past, as did the realists when they rejected Romanticism as a literary style. And the reason being is after the Civil War, there was so much death and carnage, and photography had just been invented. So everybody in the United States saw in the newspapers for the first time the grisly deaths of all the soldiers who died in the Civil War. And so Americans became traumatized. And so there became a demand for realistic stories of telling it as it is, and telling whatever it is, the gritty details without hiding any of the facts. And so realist writers rejected Romanticism. And in art, that means that you draw something exactly the way it looks. Exactly. It's almost as if you're looking at a photograph. Okay. These days, realism, it would be called photorealism. So the generation of writers that followed William Dean Howard broke with their past, as did the realists. And then the realists, they rejected Romanticism as a literary style. So realism talks about the gritty cruelty of nature, the cruelty of society, the cruelty of war as it is. So Frank Norris, Stephen Crane, Jack London, Theodore Dreiser, Harold Frederick, Hamlin Garland, Ellen Glasgow, and Kate Chopin, to name a few, rejected the limitations of realism in terms of subject matter, while they all, to some extent, embraced the realist style of writing with its attention to detail and authenticity. They rejected realism's tendency not to offend the sensibility of readers in the genteel classes. In other words, you write it as it is. Even if something is really nasty or something is really taboo, you write it as it is. So the new writers were not afraid of provocative subject matters and wrote about the human condition in darker, grimmer contexts. They all, to some extent, were influenced by not only scientific ideas of the day, including Charles Darwin's views on evolution, but also on European writers experimenting with this new style, naturalism. Émile Zola, a prominent French novelist, had articulated a theory of naturalism known as le roman expérimental in 1880. Zola had argued that a kind of intense realism, one that did not look away from any aspect of life, including the base, the dirty, or the ugly. Also influenced by Darwin, Zola saw the human in animal terms, and he argued that a novel written about the human animal could be set up as a kind of scientific experiment, where once the ingredients were added, the story could unfold with scientific accuracy. He was interested in how hereditary traits under the influence of a particular social environment might determine how a human behaves. So under naturalism and realism, human beings are seen as animals, and how a human animal behaves in human society. And then you get to see all of the base instincts of greed. You get to see all the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the American writers like Norris, Crane, and London similarly characterized humans as part of the evolutionary landscape, as being influenced and even determined by forces of heredity and environment beyond their understanding or control. With Darwin and Zola's apparent influence, the naturalists sought to push realism even further, or as Frank Norris argued in his essay, A Place for Romantic Fiction, to go beyond the meticulous presentation of teacups, rag carpets, wallpaper, and haircloth sofas, or beyond realism as mere photographic accuracy, and to embrace the kind of writing that explores the unplumbed depths of the human heart and the mystery of sex and the black unsearched penetralia of the souls of men. Norris is calling for a grittier approach to examining the human being as essentially an upright animal and a kind of walking complex combination of inherited traits, attributes, and habits deeply affected by social and economic forces. Naturalist work went where realistic work did not go, dealing with taboo subjects for the time. Subjects such as prostitution, alcoholism, domestic violence, violent deaths, crime, madness, and degeneration. Sometimes defined as a pessimistic, materialistic determination, naturalism sought to look at human nature in a scientific light, and the author often took on the role of scientist, coolly observing the human animal in a variety of plights, and the mercy of forces beyond the control or understanding, compelled by instinct and determined by cause and effect to believe in certain, often self-destructive ways as a result of heredity and environment. In such works, the plot plays out on the material evolutionary plane, where a benevolent deity or any supernatural form is absent, and idealistic concepts such as justice, liberty, innate goodness, and morality are shown as illusions, as simple fabrications of the human animal trying to elevate itself above the other animals. In the naturalistic works, nature is indicted as indifferent, sometimes even hostile to humans, and humans are often depicted as small, insignificant, nameless losers in battles against all-powerful nature. Characters may dream of heroic actions in the midst of a battle to survive extreme conditions, but they are often trapped by circumstances, unable to summon the will to change their determined outcome. Characters rarely exhibit free will at all. They often stumble through events, victims of their own vices, weaknesses, hereditary traits, and grim social or natural environments. A male character in a naturalistic novel is often characterized as part brute, and he typically exhibits strong impulses, compulsions, or instinctive drives as he attempts to satiate his greed, his sexual urges, his decadent lust, or his desire for power or dominance. Female characters also typically exhibit subconscious drives, acting without knowing why, and unable to change course. Naturalistic works are not defined by a region. The characters may take place in the frozen Alaska wilderness, as in Jack London, or the raging sea, like in Stephen Crane, or within the slums of a city, like with Theodore Dreiser. Stylistically, naturalistic novels are written from an almost journalistic perspective, with narrative distance from action and the characters. Often characters are not given names as a way to reinforce their cosmic insignificance. The plot of the story follows the decline of a character into degeneration or death. And an example would be Theodore Dreiser when he wrote Carrie. And in it, Carrie starts out as enthusiastic, young, and she goes into the city of Chicago to make it. And she tries to become rich. She tries to climb up the social ladder. And people step all over her. They walk all over her. And in the end, she's not able to maintain her social status. When she did get rich for a while, but then people walked all over her, and then she died. She died in poverty. She just went down into a decline. So basically, in naturalism, a person is a victim of other people's brutality, of other people's animalistic behavior. In other words, humans are just brute animals with no morality, and everybody stepping on everybody, because that's all animals know how to do, is to act on instinct for their own survival and not care about anybody else. And so this is a darker version of of literature, where naturalism and realism wants to show the darker aspects of the human heart, and that humans are just brutes and animals. And so all of the stories, naturalism, like Frank Norris listed here, he wrote The Octopus. And the octopus represented the greed of the railroads, who ate up all of the land. Because, when you build a railroad, you need land to build a railroad on. And so the railroad just railroaded the farmers. They took all the farmers' land, and then the farmers became poor, and of course the railroads don't care, and then just the railroads would just, like an octopus, extend its tentacles, the railroad, across the United States. And that was where the octopus, which is greed. And so it was about one particular farmer who tried to fight the railroads so that he could keep his land. And in the end, he ended up in abject poverty because the greed of the railroads won. So therefore, man's inhumanity and cruelty to man, with no caring about anybody else but themselves. And so it shows that dark side. So that's what natural, in other words, a man's natural instinct is dark and animalistic. That's realism, and in a nutshell, naturalism, and it's a darker, grimmer literary style. And so you should actually read Frank Norris. There's this excerpt in this book, Writing the Nation. And so so what I'm doing in these videos is I'm just going over just the introductions. So in Romanticism, the previous one, it was all about love. In other words, the emotions of love, revenge. In other words, you had a character driven by emotion and self-expression. But in naturalism, after the Civil War, all of that romanticism goes out the window and is replaced by a grittier, more darker kind of literature that examines the darker side of the animal side, or the beast-like side of human nature. So that's from 1890. So naturalism ran from 1890 to 1914. Why did it stop at 1914? Because that's where World War I starts. So remember, every major war equals the birth of another literary movement. And so the American Revolution, which was the last war before with Romanticism, and then after that with naturalism, it's the Civil War. So in my next video, I'm going to talk about the birth of modernism, which occurred after World War I. So it's the end of this video. So if you have any questions about naturalism or realism, of the two, naturalism is the darker one than realism. Realism simply portrays everything accurately, like photorealism. But then naturalism goes farther in order to explore taboo subjects and explore the darker side of human nature. Of the two, naturalism is the darker one.